First Men in the Moon is the first film I remember seeing in the cinema. I was taken to it when I was 10, possibly as a birthday treat. Now, I would have known it was based on the novel by H.G. Wells, and indeed I had already read the book because H.G. Wells' granddaughter was a teacher at my school, and thus I was inspired to read the more popular of his science fiction works at a very early age. Too young really to understand them, to be honest. However, the film impressed me at the time, hence I still have quite a vivid memory. But does it still impress me in my dotage? Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsall, an astronautical system engineer, but for convenience I'm bowing to the popular misnomer of rocket scientist for the purpose of this channel. That said, purpose being to explore how cinematic and other high-profile media depictions of spaceflight have created a fantasy version of reality that I'm calling fairy space. And it's this fairy space that is actually our culture's understanding of our universe. In the same way that fantasy notions of the newly discovered America took hold in Europe in the 16th century, leading to a lot of disappointment for those suckered into the colonies on the basis of those fantasies. We must start this movie analysis with Herbert George Wells, the author of the original novel. He was a literary titan in the first half of the 20th century. Today, he's famous for his science romances, what we call science fiction, but these were mostly at the start of his writing career, and they established his reputation. But at the time, his later works, both novels and histories, had a much bigger impact. A measure of this success was that he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times. During the Second World War, whose start he had actually predicted almost to the month in the shape of things to come, he was an active member of the Sankey Committee. Essentially, he was responsible for drafting the Sankey Declaration of the Rights of Man. This was one of several reflections as to what had gone wrong to create the horrors of the war in which everyone was now immersed. And it was an important input to the post-war United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which so many modern nationalist movements seem so anxious to ignore. In 1942, he published The Rights of Man, a short layman's guide and summary of the Sankey report. I've not read this work myself, you understand. I'm waiting for the movie. And we can expect a movie eventually, as almost all Wells's works, both science fiction and otherwise, have been used as the basis for films. And with The Shape of Things to Come, he even wrote the screenplay, which neutralised any criticism of the considerable discrepancy between the book and the film. Wells died in 1946, thus the copyright on his works only expired in 2016. So all the films we're considering here would still have had permission from, and paid royalties to, the Wells estate. Which is probably why the young Miss Wells had a house that was so much superior to all the other teachers. Although Wells's works are now in the public domain, there may be some complications with 2 of the most popular, as the Wells estate authorised 2 official sequels from British science fiction author Stephen Baxter. One of which was a seriously good novel in its own right. So, on to The First Men in the Moon, which was published in book form in 1901. However, before the book, the story had already been serialised in the Strand magazine from November 1900 to June 1901. It was not uniformly praised. Famously, Jules Verne, who had published his own Men in the Moon's novels 30 years earlier, criticised the fantasy content in the science, which sounds to me rather like trying to pull rank and arbitrarily establish the rules for science romances. Of course, the engineering and scientific rigour of Verne's original work was one of their features. Indeed, he was so clear on this aspect, it could be readily established it wouldn't work. Wells's magic that so offended Verne was a substance called calverite that could cut off gravity the way that metals could cut off electromagnetism. This was 15 years before Einstein published his The Field Equations for Gravitation outlining general relativity. So while highly speculative, calverite was not completely silly, and unlike Jules's, Verne's big guns, no one could definitively say it wouldn't work at the time. The book contained the illustrations that had been created for the Strand magazine, and there was a parallel publication in the Cosmopolitan magazine in the United States, which was also then published as a book, but with different illustrations. These illustrations gave a visual reference that was probably needed by the readers given the novelty of the subject, but it also left a legacy that influenced all the later media, in particular the 1964 film. This was not the first film adaptation of the book. We can argue the degree to which it influenced Méliès's La Voix de la Lune, and I do just that in my video on that film. Later in 1919 there was a British film which was an open adaptation of the novel. I've not seen this myself, indeed the chances of anyone now alive having seen it are pretty remote, as this is a lost film. But if you do happen to find it on a VHS tape in your attic, the British Film Institute would love to hear from you. However, judging from the surviving production stills, we do not seem to be missing out on a 2001 or an Avatar. That makes the 1964 Columbia Pictures offering the earliest film version we have, but there is another later version made by the BBC, which I will touch upon later. Of the many world screen adaptations, I think two are important in the lead up to First Men in the Moon. Both were made by George Powell, and they are the 1953 The War of the Worlds and the 1960 The Time Machine. Many Wells stories are suitable for successful low-budget productions, but some of the more famous and expansive science romances need a decent effects budget to capture the spectacle described in the books. Now, Powell did not shortchange us in either movie, and both were critical and audience successes. But The Time Machine was a standout by both measures, in part by sticking more closely to the story and the setting of the original novel. So, adapting a Wells novel and advertising the fact was probably seen as a safe selling point. Now, although George Powell was not involved in First Men in the Moon, the lesson of stick to the book seems to have been taken on board by the production team, who set the story at the turn of the 19th century and in England, and then stayed moderately close to the book plot. The Powell movies had both been made in America. In the case of The Time Machine, because it proved cheaper to fake London in California rather than film on location in God's chosen country. For First Men in the Moon, the producer's job was given to Charles Schneer, who we have already met as the producer of the Wernher von Braun biopic I Aim at the Stars. And although an American, thanks to Hollywood's blacklist of possible pinko lefties, Schneer had ended up in London, and thereafter made his movies in Britain, even though they were funded by the American Columbia Pictures and intended primarily for the American market. It meant that almost all the production team were British, only the director and one of the major cast members were American. So inevitably, this is essentially a British production. Even the spacesuits were British, borrowed from the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The inevitable consequence is that the end result is soaked in tea and warm beer. It reeks Britishness, so perhaps it's not a surprise that it was a success in Britain but not in the States. There is a very good and extended discussion on this aspect of the film in a YouTube video from the Every Single Sci-Fi Film Ever channel, but there are 2 points that I would like to add. The first point can be seen by comparing with The Time Machine. As already mentioned, budgetary concerns meant that The Time Machine was filmed in California because it was cheaper to fake London than to go there. But the end result is an American perception of London that will feel right to an American audience, even if it feels a little wrong to a true-born Brit. First Men in the Moon revels in real Britain, which is a foreign land as far as Americans are concerned, and that is definitely not a selling point given the large proportion of Anglophobes sloshing around in the United States of America. The British casting was also likely a negative for American audiences. The Time Machine was a breakout lead role for Rod Taylor, but he had 5 years of a career in America building audience awareness. So to an American audience, the cast of The Time Machine had a familiar look. But for First Men in the Moon, Edward Judge and Lionel Jeffries, while having extensive British careers, would have been unknown in America. Now, to be fair, the producers seem to have been aware of this issue and brought in a token American, Martha Hyer, who had a reasonable presence in Hollywood, including an Oscar nomination. She manages well in a role that does seem to be a little superfluous to the plot, which is hardly a surprise, as it is. Welles's original story did not include any enticing young ladies, and the reason for adding an American sexy bint to the original all-British male story is clear from this publicity shot. In the story, she takes on a role as an agent of chaos to help up the comedic element, which highlights the film's main artistic flaw, at least in the judgment of its own producers. Welles's original work had almost no humour, and apparently the first draft script by Nigel Neal followed this aesthetic, but a rewrite by Jan Reid added the humorous elements. Given the way the film was going, they made the apparently very sensible decision to cast Lionel Jeffries as the eccentric Mr. Calvor. Now, in the novel, Calvor is eccentric and naive, but he's not funny. But if you want funny eccentric, then Jeffries is your man, and he does not disappoint here. But that is assuming that you wanted funny eccentric, and with hindsight, in this case, you probably didn't. The man responsible for this change in tone was the boss, Charles Sneer. However, to be fair, he had to deal with several problems adapting a turn-of-the-century story that was addressing turn-of-the-century British issues. The first is that massive advances in physics over the 20th century made the idea of being able to just cut off gravity a way bigger stretch of credibility. Actually, on second thoughts, that's not a problem because who the hell understands general relativity? The second problem is that the real moon landings were imminent and the subject of massive public interest. This is a double-edged sword. On the plus side, the public interest in the moon would significantly increase the potential audience for a film about moon landings. Not that there was any shortage of such movies, as we have seen in many previous videos. But the Wells story was a genuine opportunity to offer something a little different. However, the writers still felt it needed something to link it to the contemporary zeitgeist, as understood by the audience. And that is a problem. To resolve this, they added a framing subplot in which a UN mission performs the first lunar landing using realistic contemporary technology, only to find a Union Jack and a handwritten claim for the moon in the name of Queen Victoria, which leads to an elderly Arnold Bedford, the narrator in the original novel, to then tell Welles's story. This framing narrative has two issues. The first is that the chances of an international cooperative mission at this time was a little less realistic than gravity-cutting Calvorite. I assume that they were trying to widen its international appeal, but given the key market was America, I can't help feeling that depicting a NASA-only landing would not only have been more realistic, but would have gone down a whole lot better where it mattered. The second issue with this new subplot is the ludicrous proposition that the first landing on the moon would be in walking distance of the place where Bedford and Calvor had landed at random decades earlier. The surface area of the moon is greater than Africa, so the chances of this coincidence are microscopically small and well into the "come on, that's not really credible" territory. Okay, Now to the third problem with the novel adaptation, and that is related to the second. Space generally, and the moon race in particular, were high in the public consciousness, so there is an expectation in the audience as to what space is like, even if that expectation is based on fairy space. The production did update a few things. The Wells novel assumed that the moon had an atmosphere, but that would not wash with a 1960s audience. So in the movie they used diving suits as spacesuits, which in reality would not work because of ballooning, but at least they acknowledged a lunar atmosphere was a ridiculous notion. But the main weapon Charles Schneer used to get pseudo-realism led to a special treat. He turned to his friend, the acknowledged master of special effects at the time, Ray Harryhausen. Schneer and Harryhausen had moved to London at the same time, although for very different reasons. And they already had a long history of working together on successful movies going back to 1955. The previous year, the pair had produced Jason and the Argonauts, one of the acknowledged showcases of Ray Harryhausen's genius. First Men in the Moon is much more subdued with the effects, and they are much less prominent, but I would argue this actually helps the film's longevity, as it stands up well against modern effects. It has among the best pre-Apollo surface depictions, on a par with Chesley Bonnestell's work in Destination Moon. And Ray Harryhausen got a lot of support to get it right. Now, I'm not sure how much use Mr. Garrett was, as he was just a general science communicator with no special expertise in space. But NASA and the Royal Aircraft Establishment definitely did know what they were talking about. While you probably don't watch this movie for the Harryhausen effects, they are way more than adequate to provide a convincing impression of a pseudo-reality. If anything, this highlights Harryhausen's real genius. He supplies what the movie needs, and in this case the subtlety, and what can be perceived as reality, is what anchors the film to a digestible 1960s version of the original novel. He does a very good job of realising Wells's moon cows and Selenites in his signature style, and one of the skeletons from Jason and the Argonauts gets a reprise. But he's also responsible for this famous starting scene showing the UN landing. Now, it is full of fairy space mistakes, and the green screening is not up to modern standards, but Harryhausen was clearly listening to his NASA contacts, although remember at this time they did not know what the lunar module would look like, hence the differences with Apollo. And NASA was obviously impressed with the end result because it used this scene to explain how Apollo was going to work. Although I have some trouble establishing exactly how they used it, the accounts are rather contradictory. In many respects, Schneer and Harryhausen did produce the definitive film version of Wells's novel. It has some flaws, like overdoing the comedy, and they made some mistakes if they wanted to guarantee American success. But I think overall there's little to find by way of faults in this movie from an artistic perspective. Everything follows the effects example. There is nothing showy or flashy, and while it's not a masterpiece, it's a very watchable piece of cinema. Indeed, re-watching it for this video analysis, I found it quite a bit better than I remembered. But although the definitive film version had been made, somebody thought they could do better. That somebody being Mark Gatiss, and thus we get to the 2010 BBC adaptation. This seems to have been a bit of a passion project for Gatiss, who not only wrote the screenplay but also plays Joseph Calvor, who he has promoted from a Mr. to a Professor. Given this was a low-budget film, made for a low-audience, highbrow television channel, what was it going to offer over a successful Hollywood-funded, made-for-cinema movie? Well, accuracy to the original novel, and not just the story. Wells did not write pure adventures. There was always a moralising subtext, and in First Men in the Moon he returns to his anti-imperialism theme by playing out War of the Worlds in reverse. This time it is the men from Earth being the invaders from outer space. He is also playing with the notion of entrenched social divisions, parodying it with the Selenite society. Both film interpretations keep the rather difficult and unsavoury aspects of Bedford's character, which rather reduces our sympathy for him. In the case of the 1964 film, I think this is just another put-off for the audience. But for Gatiss, it is the mirror to explore the consequence of humanity's acquisitive nature. So Wells's moralising is all lost in the 1964 movie, and Mark Gatiss puts it back. Many critics of this production have argued the effects are clearly low budget, and I think that's a little unfair. The special effects are kept to a minimum, just what is needed to tell the story, but those that are there work well enough, or even rather good in places. But the good Mr. Gatiss still had essentially the same problems that Mr. Schneer had 45 years earlier. If anything, the subsequent half-century of increased data has secured the theory of general relativity. But then again, general ignorance of what it is has also increased, so while it should be a problem, it isn't. His second problem is that the real Apollo moon landings are now part of history. He acknowledges this with a similar framing story to Schneer. In this case, an elderly Arnold Bedford tells the story to a credulous young boy while the Apollo 11 landing is taking place. And it's done in a way that is consistent with real history. His third problem is the audience's understanding of space reality, which, while still very much fairy space, has pushed the original Wells story even more into the realm of fantasy. The good news for the esteemed Mr. Gatiss is that almost nobody cares about real space, and after decades of Star Trek and Star Wars and the like, the public has a fantasy immunity and can swallow massive doses of ridiculous nonsense without any major medical side effects. And of course, reality was never the point here. It has some accidental reality high points because, for cost reasons, they just use real NASA images. But also it has some real howlers, like the Earth's position moving in the lunar sky. Wells's original work did set a few silly fairy space tropes in concrete, some of which still make occasional appearances. The main offender being that one man in a garden shed can make a spaceship. I would argue that a simple aircraft, not much beyond a microlight, is the upper bound of what one person can produce alone. History shows that beyond that you need a team and systems engineering. However, as entertainment, the novel and both movie offerings are worth tackling. If you're looking for an uncomplicated romping adventure, then the 1964 film is for you. If you want to explore the subtext in the original story, then maybe the 2010 BBC version is probably more your fare. But then again, you could always just read the book.